Will you support your role as Secretary of State, Taiwan's right to have a voice in international affairs, participate in international forums? And will you support the Porcupine Strategy, providing that we will supply them with defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability? By the way, that phrase is from the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. It's in our current law.
Yeah, let me just point out that in the Taiwan Relations Act, I believe at the year 2016, I was the lead Republican sponsor in reauthorizing and reinvigorating it. I think that the multiple consecutive presidential administrations of both parties have made clear that the policy of the United States towards Taiwan is encapsulated not just in the Taiwan Relations Act, but in the 6 assurances that multiple administrations, including the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, have made clear our policies. With regards to your second point about international forums, ASEAN is a great example of one in which that's being tested. Last year at their conference, the Chinese were able to prevent participation by the Taiwan, any mention of Taiwan in the memorandum. And then this year they're working very hard to make sure that no one associated with Taiwan is anywhere near it. So it's just one more example of how they're being excluded in that regard. On the Porcupine Strategy, because I know it may sound weird to people if anyone's watching this. I know what the ratings are, but hopefully not high. But let me just say that when the Porcupine Strategy, what it really means is you want to make the cost of invading Taiwan higher than the benefit personally. And as a result, I think we need to wrap our head around the fact that unless something dramatic changes, like an equilibrium where they conclude that the costs of intervening in Taiwan are too high, we're going to have to deal with this before the end of this decade.
How we need to make sure we're shaping that conversation.
Yeah, and well, the first is to understand that the one China policy is, and the U.S. policy towards the issue of Taiwan has been consistent and reaffirmed by every administration since 1979. It is the combination of the Taiwan Relations Act with the 6 assurances that make clear the United States, we're not going to pressure Taiwan in any arrangement. We're not going to tell you when we're going to stop, if ever. We make no commitment to not helping them in their national defense. We're not going to force any outcomes. And frankly, we are going to do everything when we reject any effort to coerce, intimidate, and or forcibly drive Taiwan to do whatever China wants them to do. And that's been our position, and that will continue. That was the position under President Trump's first administration. I anticipate will continue to be in the second administration. I think within that context, it's important for us to find every opportunity possible to allow Taiwan to engage in international forums where important issues are discussed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Rubio. And I've enjoyed working with you on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which engages in many issues related to their treatment of folks from the Tibetans to the Uyghurs, to their position regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan. But let's talk about Taiwan. I had the chance to go to Taiwan in the year 2000. It was the second presidential election there, and it was the first one where people were becoming convinced that they actually might be able to hold a democracy. I believe they've earned the right to have a voice in international affairs, and I also believe that they are at great risk right now with mainland China, Xi's plan to be aggressive militarily towards them, as my colleague Senator Ricketts just noted. Will you support in your role as Secretary of State Taiwan's right to have a voice in international affairs, participate in international forums? And will you support the Porcupine Strategy, providing that we will supply them with defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability? By the way, that phrase is from the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. It's in our current law.
Yeah, let me just point out that on the Taiwan Relations Act, and I believe of the year 2016, I was the lead Republican sponsor in reauthorizing and reinvigorating it. I think that the multiple or consecutive presidential administrations of both parties have made clear that the policy of the United States towards Taiwan is encapsulated not just in the Taiwan Relations Act, but in the 6 assurances that multiple administrations, including the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, have made clear are our policies. With regards to your second point about international forums, ASEAN is a great example of one in which that's being tested. Last year at their conference, the Chinese were able to prevent participation by the Taiwan, any mention of Taiwan in the memorandum. And then this year they're working very hard to make sure that no one associated with Taiwan is anywhere near it. So this is just one more example of how they're being excluded. I would also point to the Western Hemisphere. I know that sounds like half a world away, but you understand this issue. The majority of nations on Earth that continue to recognize and have relations with Taiwan, the vast bulk of them, or the plurality, are within the Western Hemisphere. They've undertaken a very aggressive action in just the last 7-8 years to get these countries to flip. They got Panama to flip, and they got Panama to convince the Dominican Republic to flip. They've targeted multiple other nations, and Nicaragua most recently, to flip. So I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind and make a priority. And I also think it's important to recognize allies in the region like Paraguay that have not flipped, and others who have stayed strong in that regard. On the Porcupine Strategy, because I know it may sound weird to people, or if anyone's watching this, I know what the ratings are, but hopefully not high. But let me just say that when the Porcupine Strategy, what it really means is you want to make the cost of invading Taiwan higher than the benefit. We want to discourage that by the Chinese believing that, yes, could they ultimately win an invasion of Taiwan, but the price would be too high to pay. It's basically deterrence. And I think that's critical, not just to defending Taiwan, to preventing a cataclysmic military intervention in the Indo-Pacific. And that's what it would be. And I would make one more point, and again, I don't mean to want to be alarmist about it, but if you listen to Xi Jinping, and it's important when you listen to him, and I say listen, read, don't read the English translation that they put out, because the English translation is never right. You have to read the real translation on what they actually said in their native tongue. What they're basically saying is that this is a foundational and definitional issue for Xi Jinping personally. And as a result, I think we need to wrap our head around the fact that unless something dramatic changes, like an equilibrium where they conclude that the costs of intervening in Taiwan are too high, we're going to have to deal with this before the end of this decade.
And so strongly support for the Porcupine Strategy. Thank you. And I know people in Taiwan...
I just don't like saying porcupine, but yes.
You know, when I went to Taiwan in November and met with the president and other leaders, they are extremely nervous right now. And part of the reason they're nervous is they're concerned about how things play out in Ukraine as possibly creating an incentive for China. And I take your point about the current stalemate and the fact that there is a range of objectives that are out of reach for other side. But I do feel like our partnership with NATO and our continued supply of war material that enable Ukrainians to keep fighting until that resolution is done is extremely important, because if Ukraine collapses, it will say a lot to China about whether we will stay the course in assisting Taiwan. Not to mention, it will be a catastrophe for democracy and a catastrophe for the Ukrainians. I don't know if you share that view.
Well, I think, first of all, our goal, as President Trump has stated, is he wants the dying to stop. He wants the killing to stop. So it's very difficult to reach an accord or an agreement that begins with a ceasefire and ends with a peace agreement unless both sides have some leverage. Now, there's some leverage that exists beyond military capabilities as well. We have a significant number of sanctions on the Russian Federation, and they continue to grow and expand, and other nations do as well. And that will have to be part of this conversation in terms of bringing about a peaceful resolution. And then there's the question of the long-term security and stability of Ukraine. Beyond even if the conflict were to end, there needs to be the capability of Ukraine to defend itself. And it's a point that I made back as far as 2014, when the United States under the Obama administration chose not to provide weapon capabilities, and I think we lost deterrent during that period.
I'm going to keep rolling here for a few other questions. One of the things China is doing is deeply engaged in transnational repression, which means threatening people here in the United States that they will disappear or kill or harm their family members back in China if they exercise their free rights here in our country. And also they're seeking to repatriate Uyghurs who have escaped China. And right now there are 48 Uyghurs that are in Thailand, and Thailand is on the verge of repatriating them back to China. Will you lobby for Thailand to not send these Uyghurs back to the horror they will face if they're returned?
Yes, and the good news is that Thailand is actually a very strong U.S. partner, strong historical ally as well, and so that is an area where I think diplomacy could really achieve results because of how important that relationship and how close it is. I think it's also one more opportunity for us to remind the world of what exactly we're talking about here. This is not some obscure issue. These are people who are basically being rounded up because of their ethnicity and religion, and they are being put into camps. They're being put into what they call re-education centers. They're being stripped of their identity. Their children's names are being changed. It's one of the most horrifying things that's ever happened, and they're being put into forced labor, literally slave labor.
And I will say our work together on the Forced Labor Prevention Act, Uyghur Forced Labor, was tremendous. Thank you for championing that. I'm encouraging other nations, including Canada, Mexico, and Europe, to follow the rebuttable presumption strategy we put into that bill, because right now, if our slave labor products or China's slave labor products are rejected here, they're shipped to Canada, and we need to expand on that. I want to turn to another point. our companies face in China often the requirement for partnerships or location or what products they can produce or the theft of their intellectual property. Meanwhile, we're helping their economy by being a major supplier of fossil gas, LNG, to China. Should we be strengthening the Chinese economy by sending them LNG?
Well, I think that is a good point to raise in that regard, because I will tell you that is one of the things that's going to have to be discussed in the broader relationship with China. And that is, it is one of the things we actually export to China. They import a lot this way. One of the few things that we export is, in great capacity, is these long-term contracts that are tied up either directly to China or through third countries. Because some of this obviously is exported to a third country who in turn sends it to China either as a direct sale or as a byproduct. So I think that has to be on the table as a number of other measures that we have in leverage as we engage the Chinese in this geopolitical perspective. I would go further and point out that the Chinese also have, I believe, the world's largest surplus refining capacity. They've invested very heavily in that as well. And that's one more area where I think our energy policy will be critical and bringing some geopolitical stability to our relationship.
To be on this committee. Senator Rubio, for the last 7 years, from a distance of about 600 feet, that's what separates the House chamber and the Senate chamber, I've watched and admired your work from a distance. And on a few, but very fortunate times, I've had the chance to actually be wind at your back on some of your work supporting Taiwan and protecting Hong Kong dissidents as we work together on some legislation. Now, in a twist of events, I sit not far from where you once sat, and there's another symbolic 600 feet between us, between the State Department and the Senate. And I'm excited to work with you in your new role. And I would like to continue to be wind at your back on a lot of issues, and none more important to me than China. And if you remember really nothing else about our short interchange today, please know that that's very important to me, and I hope to work with you on what I view the aggression of China, and in many ways their global push for military and economic supremacy, I think, is a threat in many ways. China is imposing it's what they call China One principle on the world, which is very different than you know from our China policy. Can you kind of describe how we can push back on that and how we need to make sure we're shaping that conversation?
Yeah, and well, the first is to understand that the One China policy is, and the U.S. policy towards the issue of Taiwan has been consistent and reaffirmed by every administration since 1979. And it is the combination of the Taiwan Relations Act with the 6 assurances that make clear that the United States, we're not going to pressure Taiwan into any arrangement. We're not going to tell you when we're going to stop, or if ever. We make no commitment to not helping them in their national defense. We're not going to force any outcomes. And frankly, we are going to do everything, and we reject any effort to coerce, intimidate, and or forcibly drive Taiwan to do whatever China wants them to do. And that's been our position, and that will continue. That was the position under President Trump's first administration. I anticipate it will continue to be in the second administration. I think within that context, it's important for us to find every opportunity possible to allow Taiwan to engage in international forums where important issues are discussed, and they're not represented. Irrespective of what China claims about One China principle, they're not represented. And so the views there need to be made. They need to have an opportunity in these forums to be made clear. But I think stability is critically important. Here's the one thing I would point to here with regards to stability. If the Chinese are in fact serious about stabilizing U.S.-China relations and finding avenues of which we can be cooperative and avoid conflict, then they will not do anything rash or irrational when it comes to Taiwan or the Philippines, for that matter. The actions they are taking now are deeply destabilizing. They are forcing us to take counteractions because we have commitments to the Philippines and we have commitments to Taiwan that we intend to keep. And so if they want to destabilize the relationship, or they want to help at least create some pathway for stabilization of our relationship with them, even as we remain engaged in global competition, and in some cases more adversarial than others, they really need to stop messing around with Taiwan and with the Philippines, because it's forcing us to focus our attention in ways we prefer not to have to.
As a matter of interest, I actually lived in Taiwan in August of 1979, 3 months after that act that you referred to, and I think you're very accurate. I think for a minute about Europe, and there's some countries it feels like in Europe, because of their presence, Poland, Czech Republic, and Baltics that are more in tune with this issue, but as a whole, it feels like some European nations are in denial of some of the things you've just said. You talk a little bit about how we work with our NATO friends over there and how we get them to appreciate this and actually play a part in this?
Well, I think in the case of NATO, I think I would expand it to really talk about the European Union and the EU, which I think is increasingly every single day coming to the realization of the threat that China's mercantilist policies and unfair trade policies are posing to them. They are flooding the European market with their cheaper electric cars, or attempting to do so. There's a dispute now about the importation of aluminum on sector after sector. You're seeing the EU confronting the reality. By the same token, you know, they're like many countries around the world, including ours to some extent, there's a quandary involved. There is an intermeshing economic relations that you can't just walk away from, but you also recognize the long-term threat that Chinese practices are having on your economic lives. And so I think that's an area in which the Europeans are, some more than others, are increasingly aware and willing to be more forceful. Italy has been willing to lean into it more than perhaps some other countries in the region. Hopefully that will continue to change. On the security front, look, an event in the Indo-Pacific, say, let's leave Taiwan out of it for a moment and say it's the Philippines. Okay, in the last 48 hours, there's this massive, I don't even know how to describe it, but this massive ship that the Chinese have built that's like headed towards the Philippines, and the Philippines feels threatened by it, rightfully so. We've seen this on a daily basis with the harassment and so forth, but on a daily basis. If, God forbid, there is some miscommunication or some inadvertent conflict emerges there, and we have obligations to them, the impact that will have on the entire globe, the impact that it will have on the entire globe is enormous, and that includes Europe. So they have a selfish, vested interest in seeking for the Chinese to curb their behaviors. I would also point to the Europeans that what the Russians have done with Ukraine would not have been possible without the assistance of China, whether it's the sharing of technology or aid in evading sanctions or selling their oil in secondary markets. The Chinese have been hidden, but clear to everyone watching, partners in the Russian endeavor.
Yeah.
And the Europeans know this, and they need to be continually reminded of it because it reveals the nature of who we're dealing with.
That was actually my next question, so I'm going to skip that one, but thank you for addressing that. I want to turn to Hong Kong. I mentioned I lived over in that area, and I actually remember as a young man in the 1980s shopping for a camera in Hong Kong. As a businessman in the 2000s, I tried to sell my product over there in Hong Kong. I've been over there a number of times as a tourist and just enjoyed that beautiful city. And unfortunately, today, none of that is possible. As a matter of fact, I actually have a warrant for my arrest over there because of the work in the house that I've done over there. Can you talk a little bit about the role there, and what's even worse is Hong Kong's now playing a role in facilitating sanctions evasion and money laundering. And can you address that issue? And
well, I think it's important to take 30 seconds down memory lane. Hong Kong was turned over by the UK with a strong set of assurances that it would remain autonomous and independent. It would be governed by the Chinese, but independent. They would have a democracy. There would be free enterprise. They would be left alone. In essence, they would, that's the promises they made. They have violated over time, they violated every promise. They basically broke the deal. Just like they lied about all the island chains that they said they weren't going to populate and militarize, and they have done so as well. And so today, we cannot consider Hong Kong to truly be autonomous anymore. It is not. It is now under the full control, especially on national security matters, of Chinese authorities. And it should not be surprising to us that these deeply rooted banking institutions that are in Hong Kong, who long have served as financial capital on the global scale, are now being used to the benefit of the Communist Party and to evade global sanctions. And I think there has to be a growing recognition of that. I also think it's important to remind those sectors in finance that are still involved there that the Chinese national security now that's now been implemented in Hong Kong allows them, if they don't like what you're doing, to basically trump up any charges they want, go into your offices, raid the boxes, see all of your files, threaten to jail you, and they've done so in some cases. So it's no longer a hospitable place for people to conduct financial activity. So I think we have to call it for what it is. The notion that Hong Kong is now some autonomous entity that operates within China's system but independent of it and the decisions they make is a complete work of fiction.
Yeah, and I hate to, I want one more quick question, but I also want to point out before we go on how good it could have been for Hong Kong and China had they kept that agreement. I think that'd been a whole lot better for China. Last question as we run out of time. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation about Panama in the news. Can you talk about the Chinese influence in the Panama Canal,
Yeah,
what Americans should know?
Well, let me tell you, I actually didn't print a lot of, things to read like verbatim here, but there's one that I thought was interesting that I wanted to share, and I'm not going to put it out there for everybody, but the whole thing, but maybe I'll submit it for the record. But I just went through, this thing with Panama on the canal is not new. I visited there, I think it was 2016. I think I've consistently seen people express concern about it, and it's encapsulated here in quote after quote. Let me tell you, the former U.S. ambassador who served under President Obama said, the Chinese see in Panama what we saw in Panama throughout the 20th century, a maritime and aviation logistics hub. Just immediate past head of U.S. Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, said, I was just in Panama about a month ago and flying along the Panama Canal and looking at the state-owned enterprises from the People's Republic of China on each side of the Panama Canal. They look like civilian companies or state-owned enterprises that could be used for dual use and could be quickly changed over to a military capability. We see questions that were asked by the ranking member in the House China Select Committee, where he asked a witness and they agreed that in a time of conflict, China could use its presence on both ends of the canal as a choke point against the United States in a conflict situation. So the concerns about Panama have been expressed by people on both sides of the aisle for at least the entire time that I've been in the United States Senate, and they've only accelerated further. And this is a very legitimate issue that we face there. And I think I'm not prepared to answer this question because I haven't looked at the legal research behind it yet, but I'm compelled to suspect that an argument could be made that the terms under which that canal were turned over have been violated because while technically sovereignty over the canal has not been turned over to a foreign power, in reality, a foreign power today possesses, through their companies, which we know are not independent, the ability to turn the canal into a choke point in a moment of conflict, and that is a direct threat to the national interest and security of the United States, and it's particularly galling given the fact that we paid for it and that 5,000 Americans died making it. That said, Panama is a great partner on a lot of other issues, and I hope we can resolve this issue of the canal and of its security and also continue to work with them cooperatively on a host of issues we share in common, including what to do with
Thank you.
migration.
Senator, I'm out of time. Thank you so much.